Hi, Scott. Happy to be here. I love this series.
You keep mentioning that number, Scott, and you're making me feel
Is it
old. But
40?
Sorry, I get all stressed out thinking about it.
So eating one's own dog food or drinking your own champagne.
Spoiler alert.
Welcome to another episode of What I Wish I Knew. Today, we're going to look back at key learnings from 2022. We covered a lot of different topics across 5 episodes. Now, going back to our first episode and my first guest, Joel Shapiro, remember he's the professor of data analytics at Northwestern University. And I reached out to Joel to better understand about AI and how AI can help sales operations. Now, one of the things that Joel mentioned that has really stuck with me is to think of AI as an efficiency play.
And it's this confluence of events. I mean, that's where computational sophistication just kicks human beings' butts, right? I mean, we can spend, we're two pretty smart guys. We can sit there and we can look at data for a pretty long time. Lots of salespeople, lots of different kinds of customers, different points of the year and different, contexts, whatever it is. And we just can't process information in the same way. So figuring out those trends that say in this unique context, we're likely to see an uptick of frequency of this big deal come in. We'd have to get pretty lucky to be able to see that. And even if we could see it, we probably wouldn't be all that confident in what we're seeing. And that's why we use machines, because they're really, really good at exactly that.
Now, the upshot of AI-driven efficiency is that it saves time. It keeps us from some of the laborious, boring analytical work, and ideally frees up time to do more interesting, strategic change management type of work. Now, another tip that Joel shared was that for AI to be of value, it's got to be connected to specific use cases.
If you're going to invest even a nickel, and AI typically, it doesn't have to be super expensive, but it's going to cost you at least something, you really want to know what problems you're trying to solve, or what questions you're trying to answer, or what opportunities you're trying to address. And so I get really nervous when I see companies say, we want to transform, we want to do our digital transformation because we want to embrace AI. We know that this is important and cutting edge and so forth. And when they sort of lead with the transformation or they lead with the technology, I get a little nervous.
Now, one use case that has become clear to me since the discussion with Joel has to do with data extraction and transformation. Now, for a lot of people, this can be a really painful process, but I'm learning that AI makes this process a lot more straightforward. So we're talking about extracting data from various source systems, putting it into an environment where we can transform it into something that we can then analyze. And again, AI makes this streamlined. In episode 2, I wanted to understand some of the pain points of using ACV, that's annual contract value, as the primary incentive measure for sales teams focused on enterprise SaaS business. Igor Uroic, he's a principal at the Alexander Group. He was my guest, and he spends a lot of his time focused on organizations with recurring revenue models. Now, we talked about one big issue that's often referred to as linearity or the hockey stick effect. And this issue is relating to paying on ACV, the timing of the sales, and the notion that for the people that are paid on an annual ACV quota are not sufficiently motivated to close business early in the year. So we discussed a couple of solutions, and all of these carry some trade-offs. One of them is an increase to the cost of sales, but many revenue leaders are willing to take that cost in exchange for mitigating the dreaded hockey stick effect. But Igor stressed that these types of incentive plan solutions should not come at the expense of plan simplicity. Our analytical brains lead us to places that maybe we shouldn't go, so keep it simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're starting to see that in the data on those surveys that we've been doing over the number of years. The number of organizations that are using, for example, 3 or fewer measures in their plan is now somewhere around 80%. About 5-6 years ago, it was closer to 60, right? So folks are saying, how do I distill this job to the core thing that I'm looking to incentivize and allow my sales individuals to have the creative freedom to do the right thing, right? Structure the right deal with the customer versus me legislating where here are the 7 things you got to do. And I'm going to tie exactly the incentive to each of those, right? That tends to actually be counterproductive.
Now, in episode 3, I caught up with a former colleague, Mark Davis, to learn about good practices for evaluating sales compensation plan effectiveness. Now, Mark talked about some of the best practices and pitfalls associated with building out a robust quantitative set of data for purposes of the analyses. But he also said that it's equally important to tap into a cross-functional set of qualitative inputs.
It gets beyond the quantitative analyses into more qualitative considerations too. Usually, beyond that kind of pay for performance data analysis, we're connecting with key executive stakeholders to help inform what are the go-to-market priorities, what are our expectations of the sales force, how do we measure success, and get some internal perceptions of how the current plan is working or not from a variety of executive stakeholders. And this is certainly not just the sales leadership. This should be HR, this should be finance, this should be sales ops, depending on the type of organization, maybe ops and marketing. But who are the various executive stakeholders that really have a lot of value to add in terms of painting a picture of how do we measure success? What are the key metrics that we need to be marching toward as an organization? And how do we translate those go-to-market imperatives through a sales incentive plan?
Now, the qualitative inputs include direct input from the people for whom the plan is designed to motivate, the salespeople.
When that new plan is launched, this is fodder for the new plan messaging, right? Because now sales leadership can say, you'll remember that a select number of our sales team had the opportunity to participate in interviews on the front end. Here's a summary, high-level summary of what we heard from you, and some bulleted summarization of the key points they made. Here's how we translated your input into some of the new plan features that we think you're going to be very excited about. So it's about getting early buy-in to downstream plan changes. When they feel like they've had a voice in the overall design process, likely they're not sitting around the design team table, right, with sales leadership and HR and sales ops and so forth. But when they've had a voice vis-a-vis those one-on-one interviews, they feel like they've been heard.
In episode 4, I wanted to know why so few companies evaluate the financial return on their SPM or sales performance management software investments. So Rob Blohm, my guest, has spent a big chunk of his long career working with companies to implement SPM software. So he understands a thing or two around ROI. One of the things that he had mentioned was to better demonstrate ROI, start with the business case and link elements from that case back to measurable outcomes. Most companies have a business case because that's used to secure the funding for the software. Now, from an operational perspective, it can be difficult to measure efficiency and time savings. And we talked about what can be a more practical approach is just to understand progress in user satisfaction. So if you think about, for example, the sales operations team and the people that are doing all the work to manage the sales compensation program, well, if they're disengaged, unsatisfied, in the extreme, they can leave to a company that's maybe using better technical tools, right? And by doing so, put your sales engagement at risk. Now, another tip that Rob shared around implementation was that to phase the implementation program by starting first on what are some of those more basic core capabilities of the software, scoring some quick wins, demonstrating value early, learning how to use the software before then in a later stage of implementation, focusing on those more complex capabilities like executive dashboards or sophisticated analytics.
Usually there's a lot of different people involved, right? I mean, it's not just, one or two groups. It's often HR, it's IT, it's sales ops, it's finance. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to implementing sales compensation systems, and emotions run really, really high on this because you're dealing with people's pay. And then when you equate that to sales performance and a company's strategic capability of hitting their sales objectives, the whole thing gets gets a lot of attention. So I think one of the things that I'm always a huge advocate of, as I said earlier, just keeping it as simple as you can, right? And stepping in with the realization that you may not be able to do everything on the first pass.
In episode 5, I connected with my Varicent colleague, Sarah Van Caster. She's an expert in go-to-market execution and technical tools that's used to automate sales planning. We talked a lot about volatility in the market and contrasted this with the recent spike in job openings for sales operations professionals.
But you're keying in on something definitely with sales operations that we're really seeing across industries. You're right. Not a lot of layoffs going on. Sales operations is really becoming one of the most strategic aspects of the broader go-to-market organization, and their responsibilities continue to increase across the role in general. The function's no longer just about collecting data and building reports and throwing them over to sales. Sales operations teams are really getting quite sophisticated in how they can build and manage their plans that really drive the performance of the entire sales organization.
Now, the data from the study that she mentioned aligns with Mark's notion around the evolution of the sales operations function and how leaders are really expecting a lot more and more strategic outputs from sales operations.
All of these pieces, the territories, the quotas, the compensation, looking at your capacity, all of this really needs to be done with kind of the bigger picture in mind and understanding how changes to each of these areas are going to have a ripple effect across the plans.
For greater connectivity and collaboration, she said it's critical to have an integrated set of planning tools to get the various planning functions and people out of their silos onto the same page and literally working from the same user interface. She also shares some innovative ways that companies are moving to a more fact-based, data-driven planning approach and relying less on gut instinct and input from salespeople who'd rather use their time with customers and spend less time on updating the CRM system.
It's often folded into probably the territory planning. But in addition to measuring the capacity of your organization, you also really want to make sure that part of your planning includes looking at your customers and accounts and figuring out how to segment them, how to score and rank them to really understand who should we be prioritizing? It's likely that the buying conditions, again, we're seeing this across industries, of your customers and prospects are likely changing and evolving. And there are certain things that your sellers know about their customers and certain things that they don't know. So being able to be a little bit more thoughtful, data-driven with how you're evaluating your customers' likelihood to buy is also an important piece.
When I think back across all these various topics and discussions, I see 3 common themes. The first is to keep it simple. Even something as seemingly complex as artificial intelligence relies on some basic use cases to provide value. The second theme is, it's becoming clear that so much of what we do relies on technology and data. So it's important to understand what are the latest technical innovations and what applications can make an impact to our jobs. We also have to commit to getting more out of data. And I'm becoming increasingly convinced that purpose-built tools like AI-aided ELT is a key step forward in that quest. Finally, we're all better off by tapping into the wealth of talent and expertise that's readily available. All we have to do is ask. I mean, this series demonstrates that people are willing to help, and rarely do they ask for much, if anything, in return. I'm looking forward to the new year and a new season of What I Wish I Knew, connecting or reconnecting with subject matter experts, these people that have spent their careers helping companies to grow profitable revenue. So in the meantime, I hope that you're all planning to attend Varicent's big March conference, Accelerate, in Orlando. I'm planning to be there, and I'm hoping that we can do a live episode from the conference. Until then, take care.